Hello and welcome to part 3 of a mini-series in philosophy on the meaning of existence, being and becoming. My name is Andreas Wasmuht and I am the co-convener for philosophy here at the BRSI, and it's with great pleasure that I want to take you through the third reiteration of this particular course. I hope you've enjoyed the course so far. Please provide feedback back to me. My email is andreas.wasmuht@brlsi.org. Please feel free to do that. It's always good to get people's views on the meaning of existence. Let's start with where we started in the previous two sessions. So the first part was entitled From Ritual to Religion, where we covered things like the meaning of existence stretching back into prehistory, particularly around funerary rites, abstract thought, complex language, artistic expression, and metaphysical myths. I think this has been dated back to as far as about 100,000 BCE in terms of some of these thoughts, and particularly abstract thoughts in terms of communication. This was critical for our ancestors to explore what the meaning of existence even means or begins to mean, and obviously what it meant to them may have been very different to what it is to us today. The second aspect we covered in the first lecture was a transition from religion into religion, where we had traced back the idea of the divine, the sacred, and also creation of order out of chaos, by actually having common tenets, scriptures, and celebrations and rites of the divine, to bind societies together, initially into small groups, but obviously expanding rapidly throughout the world, from about 5000 BCE or so. The purpose and meaning of existence then becomes not something personal and part of a group, but actually something that is revealed to you and is a matter of faith. This is not a matter of individual exploration. This is something that is handed down to you by the respective religion, and this provides you the tenets and ways of behaving and ways of being. Now, living in accordance with these divine rituals and practices is really a key tenet, a key factor in terms of whether you are leading a good life, whether your meaning of existence is really a wholesome one, a flourishing one, where you actually are consistent with the practices that are prescribed to you as a member of a community. Now, as I mentioned previously, Western and Eastern religions also have a very different foci. One is much more outward-looking in terms of towards the deity. The other one doesn't really distinguish between the divine and the personal, and really it is much more of a holistic approach and process. We then move on moving on from revelation to philosophy, where we encounter the philosophy in the Western world for the first time. We start off with the definition of philosophy, which is the love of wisdom, but not just any love. The Greeks already distinguished between various types of love, and philia is a brotherly, familial love. So again, it already indicates that Sophia, wisdom, is a shared endeavor, something you do with your friends, your family, etc. It's not a static state where you sit as the philosopher in your armchair, creating your own philosophy. It is an engaging and an interactive way of doing philosophy. We then talked in part 2 about the pre-Socratics, who wondered at existence itself and how the world was constituted. Thales, the first Western philosopher, thought that everything was made of water. His follower Anaximander and Anaximenes thought it was made of air, or the apeiron, the indefinite. And so on it went. And their concern was really about how is existence possible, what are things made of, what supports the world, what supports us, what are our constituent parts. Very interesting questions in relation to our being and our becoming. With Socrates, we took a slightly different turn. We actually went from abstract concepts such as existence into something very concrete, and a move from wonder into rationality. His famous expression was, "The unexamined life is not worth living," basically suggesting that our purpose in life is to actually inquire into it, into our own life, into the assumptions of other people, into the lives of other peoples, to actually explore. And this is what Socrates did in the agora, in the marketplace in Athens, which didn't earn him many friends, I must say. He was actually executed partly because of his attitude. Corruption of the young was one accusation, and clearly he also upset a lot of well-to-do Athenians in terms of constantly showing them up that they didn't really know what they thought they knew. Socrates' student, Plato, again a very important philosopher. He is the philosopher with his theory of the forms and the allegory of the cave, where effectively he positions us in a situation where this is all of humanity, are sitting in a cave looking at a screen beyond which are various shady figures moving around. But the point that Plato is making is that all we ever see is the shadows on the screen, not the real life behind the screen. So we only ever see the phenomenal, we never see the noumenal world as it is, because we never break out from our normal modes of thinking. The theory of form for Plato, very much differently to Socrates, who actually believed that you need to make the abstract concrete. You need to move from concept into context. For Plato, it is the concepts, it's the abstract that is the most important and real. So the idea of, or the theory of an idea or theory of a form is actually real in its own right. So the idea of a horse exists separate to the actual horse. The idea of justice, love, etc. also exists completely separate from actually specific instances of love and justice. So for him, for Plato that is, for him it is the purpose of existence, the meaning of existence is to rediscover the eternal ideas, eternal forms, which are outside and separate to our everyday experience. We then move on to Plato's student Aristotle, who had a diametrically opposed view. Again, it's quite easy to see that not all the philosophers, even in those days, agreed with each other. Here is Raphael's painting of the School of Athens on the right-hand side. The middle two figures are Plato and Aristotle. The middle one in Plato is on the left-hand side, pointing upwards into the sky. Aristotle, the younger fellow, points down to earth. And that shows that actually reality is very important. It needs to be grounded in actual situations. Now, for Aristotle, as we discussed in part 2, there are three key aspects to the meaning of existence. One is eudaimonia, which literally translated is a good spirit, a good approach, a good attitude to life, I suppose. It's often translated as happiness. I think that's a mistake, because happiness is quite ephemeral, it's quite short-term, it changes. Whereas eudaimonia is something that is actually a way of being, I think is the best way of describing it. So that's one. You also need to cultivate virtue, and virtue in the broader sense of not just being virtuous, but actually virtue in terms of your capacity and capability as a human being at being good at things, good at goodness as well, but also good at other mundane activities in your life. But all of these two don't really are not really sufficient, because you also need the moral conviction to carry through your good spirit and your acquired virtues into actuality, into action. If you don't do that, you're not really leading a fully flourishing life. And then we moved on to the cynics, who I described in part 2 as the punks or the hippies of philosophy, who urged us to return to a state of nature, to shun social conventions which they thought were artificial and not beneficial to humanity. The Epicureans also had a very slightly different viewpoint here. They actually thought that actually the seeking of shared pleasure and the avoidance of pain represented the highest good in terms of the friendship you exhibit. Often it's described as hedonism, which I think is incorrect. It is not about hedonism. Epicurus himself thought that the highest good is to actually share bread and wine in open conversation with your friends. So not really our modern understanding of hedonism. But it's quite interesting, because we'll come on to the utilitarianism later on in part 4, which clearly are also focusing on the idea of pleasure and pain as the two sovereign masters in human affairs. Then we went to see Stoicism, and where it is all about the acquisition of virtue that is good, and we need to be free of suffering. The only way to achieve that is to have a certain attitude to life, a stoical attitude of apatheia, in terms of not being too riled, not too upset, not too emotional about our lives, but actually transacting our everyday activities and our life in general in a very tranquil, relaxed and even manner. And things are happening for a reason which are beyond our control, and in Stoicism the divine is definitely invoked. So there are things outside our control which we have no influence over. There is no point to fret about this. All we can do is lead our lives to the best of our ability and deal with matters at hand that we have control over in the best way possible. And then finally, we covered skepticism, which is a very interesting philosophical branch, because actually it focuses on inquiry. The purpose of life, the meaning of existence really is to inquire, to live life, but also to inquire into it, what lies behind things. And to do this in a very tranquil way, which is described as ataraxia by the skeptics. Now, the skepticism isn't the same skepticism that we encounter in the modern world. The skepticism is more, in the Greek world, is more a suspension of judgment. So the idea is not to actually jump to a conclusion, but to weigh up both sides of an argument, for example, and then come to a rational conclusion, rather than jumping emotionally on one side rather than the other. Now we're encountering the wisdom of the East. That was just an introduction in terms of the past 2 lectures. And I must announce at the very beginning that I already apologize for my pronunciation, both in terms of Hinduism and as well as Chinese philosophy. So please bear with me. I remember one day a participant in one of the philosophy lectures picked me up even just for the word Hinduism, as saying that it's not such a thing as a Hinduism. And I just want to make sure that people realize I'm not using it as an ism. I'm really just using it as a descriptor of a Eastern philosophy as well as religion. Now having the preamble out of the way, we can now go on and at least discuss the sort of orthodox Astika philosophical schools. There's also unorthodox Nastika philosophical schools in India, which we all come to at least to one of them later on, which is Buddhism. But let's move ahead. Again, in terms of the various philosophical schools, they're all based on some consistency. In Hinduism, one of the key phenomenon or edicts is Purusharthas, and they're really the 4 key guides to human life. The objects of human life, I suppose, is more or less a translation of Purusharthas. The first one is karma, which is pleasure and joy. The second is artha, which is wealth and prosperity. The third is dharma, which can be translated as virtue but also as duty. And finally, moksha, which is the liberation from the ongoing rebirth of samsara and past karma, past actions in our past lives as well as the current. So, starting off with the first orthodox philosophical school is Samkhya, where energy and soul, which is Purusha, and matter, Prakriti, pervade the universe. So these are two forces in the universe, and we come on to the Chinese philosophers in a while, and there's a clear relationship here between yin and yang, and it is all about the balance of the three gunas. Rajas, which is the active dynamic element, tamas, which is chaos and the passive and sometimes described as the ignorant element, and sattva, which is the positive and harmonious and virtuous state. And it is the balance of these three gunas that is the purpose of the universe and the individual. It is about returning the universe as well as the individual back into balance. The second orthodox philosophical school is Raja Yoga, which is disciplines in terms of mind and body, focusing on self-control, on discipline, on exercise, as you would expect from yoga as it's known in the West, breathing techniques, also known in the West, but also withdrawal from the senses and deep meditation and concentration. And you need to be able to have both your mind and body in sync, in balance, to actually be able to achieve chitta consciousness. The next of the philosophical school is Nyaya, which is very different. It is very much focused on rationality and reason, and looking at where we are able to get rationality and knowledge from through reason. So there's the knowledge from perception, what we see in the world. There is knowledge from comparison, looking at different things in different ways and looking at the differences between them. And there's also knowledge from inference and reliable testimony. Now, again, we've already spoken about the Socratic school of thought, and I think Socrates would have been quite at home with Nyaya as a philosophical construct. Now, the next school is Vaishika, where life is all about distinction, about substance distinction, quality distinction, distinction in activities, also generalities, particularities. So I suppose we're talking here about concepts and contexts and inherence. And it's the distinction between matters and thoughts that really bring out the meaning of existence. Mimamsa is the fifth school that we're going to be discussing, and here again it is a process of knowledge, of acquiring wisdom, starting with perception, moving to inference, comparison, postulation, negative proof and testimony. I suppose that isn't very different in terms of what is proposed than the modern scientific method in terms of actually arriving at truth. It's an hermeneutic and linguistic approach to the interpretation of scriptures, to arrive at facts as truths that people can incorporate from those scriptures. And then finally, Vedanta, which literally means the end of the Vedas, the first of which is the Rig Veda, dating back to about 1500 BCE or even before, and the insights from the Upanishads. Now, both propose a sort of monism, but also have dualistic approaches. And I suppose it all centers around the union, I suppose, of the Atman and the Brahman, the ultimate reality and the eternal universe. And it is often described as Aum or Om in the Buddhist tradition, where the A stands for waking, the U for dreaming, and the M for dreamless. And the combination of those three factors of waking, dreaming, and dreamless, you achieve absolute consciousness. So here are some of the sort of philosophical thoughts in Hinduism around mind and matter, about body and mind, about rationality, differentiation, a process of acquiring knowledge, and an interpretation of the oneness of the universe and the combination of duality between the Brahman and the Atman. Okay, I mean, in terms of the Vedanta, I mean, the key people here in this tradition are Adi Shankara in about the 8th century in the Common Era. And again, the Atman, the self and soul, and Brahman, which is the unchanging reality, are one. They're just different aspects of the same thing. So to some extent, it is like a hologram, where every part of the hologram is actually a small picture of the whole. The physical world in Advaita Vedanta is an illusion, Maya, and it's the union with Brahman that requires its renunciation. So very much like previous philosophy, the phenomenal world is only the world we encounter. It's not the real world. It is an illusion, and we need to break beyond that by actually unifying with Brahman. Vishittadvaita Ramanjuna is a dualist and a qualified dualist, where the Atman and Brahman are not identical but real. However, the former can achieve union with the latter. So they are not a single entity where one is part of the other. This is more of a quest to actually return to the whole. Dvaita is very different. Brahman and Atman are entirely different. The former is perfect in every way. This is the universal aspect, and only through the total surrender to the universe or to the Brahman and Brahman's love and wisdom is salvation possible. So this is not something we can achieve on our own. This is only that can be bestowed upon us by the Brahman. So the key features of Vedanta, really, as we've seen, are that Brahman is the uncaused and eternal creator of the universe. The meaning of existence is the release from rebirth and Maya to attain moksha. And karma, in the past, present and future, life determines whether liberation is achieved. In Hinduism, we go through a whole eternity of previous lives before we can ever leave the phenomenal world. Right. I mean, obviously, we talked about the orthodox philosophies. Now, there are also unorthodox philosophies. We're not going to cover all of them. I mean, there's Buddhism and Jainism, for example, but I will just cover Buddhism, which is probably the most well known in the West. This was started by Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, who lived in the 6th century BCE, and some key concept of Buddhism, whichever denomination of Buddhism you refer to, are these. We start off with the Four Noble Truths, that all existence is impermanent and filled with dukkha. Now, dukkha is an interesting word. It is mainly described as pain. But not necessarily. It could be suffering, it could be strife, it could be toil. There's no one simple translation of dukkha. But the world is impermanent, is phenomenal, and it is filled with things we need to cope with. This coping or suffering is created as a result of craving for things, I suppose, but also for riches, for love, an attachment. Craving for something means you're attached to attaining something, or you are attached not to lose it, a samudaya. And that is what fills our entire life with suffering or strife. The solution, nirodha, is the cessation of craving. And the Buddha is very clear. We need to be non-attached in order to move forward into a state of nirvana, which we'll describe later on. And this cessation of attachment doesn't mean we don't care about things. We don't let go of things at all in terms of how we think about things. But it is a cessation of being driven, determined, not just disposed, but determined to only see life in a certain way. Magga is the path to liberation, which leads to the Noble Eightfold Path. And that you will see in the diagram to the right. And it is split into various areas. There's this sort of more philosophical aspects and the more mundane aspects, I suppose. It starts, with having the right view. And I suppose that comes back to some of the Greek philosophy in terms of having the right kind of spirit, the right kind of eudaimonia, as Aristotle would have put it. From the right view flow the right intentions. So it isn't just a consequentialist view in Buddhism. Deontology is very important. The motivations and intentions behind your thoughts and behind your speech are very, very important, because from that flow subsequent manifestations of your person, your behaviors, and your attitudes. So with the right intentions, you can have the right speech, you can communicate in the right way, this leads to the right actions, and also the right actions means that your livelihood is going to be in the right place. So, dealing with butchery, things like that, killing animals, being the wrong side of the law, this would not be seen in Buddhism as actually having the right livelihood. We then get into the last few elements, the last three elements of the Noble Eightfold Path: the right effort, doing things in the right way, with the right resolve, with the right moral compass, I suppose, is equally as important. And concentrating and having the right concentration, focusing on what is in front of you is really important. Focus on the moment, focus on the eternity at the same time. And that kind of concentration will result in delivering you the right mindfulness. And mindfulness is not just for yourself, but it's a mindfulness that you should exhibit to the rest of humanity and the rest of the world in general. So, in Buddhism, the meaning of existence is the liberation from dukkha and to achieve nirvana. And nirvana literally means blowing out. It's a state of bliss, a state of non-self, and it is a state of enlightenment. Now, people think nirvana is a non-existence and effectively cessation of life, i.e. death. I don't think that's how nirvana should be interpreted. Nirvana is literally a progression from being self-centered to being non-centered, and actually being at one with the world, the universe, and everything around you. And then another concept within Buddhism is that in order to achieve the Noble Eightfold Path, there are three jewels which are critical. One is Buddha himself and the teachings of the Buddha. Dharma is the virtues and the duties that we exhibit and the way we lead our lives as individuals, but also collectively. And finally, the Sangha, which is the community in which we operate, to ensure that the community acts as one, and all the individuals within the community are following the principle of enlightenment. Now we go east, even further into China, and I want to cover off three main religions here. And not so religions, but also philosophies. The first one, which is actually probably the least known in the West, is Taoism, which the founder of is Lao Tse, living in the sort of end of the 7th century BCE. I mentioned him last time as part of a religion, and the myth is that he, during the Warring States period, wants to leave his area, his state, and emigrate, and was stopped at the border by the border guard, who recognized him as Lao Tse, the famous wise man, and asked him to stay overnight and write down all his wisdom, which resulted in the book that is known as the Tao Te Ching. Okay, the Tao Te Ching is again, the translation is not easy. The Tao is either a way, it's a path, it's a road, it's somewhere to go, or somewhere to go along in a particular manner, in a particular way. It is sometimes translated as the true classic of the way and its power, and Qing can be translated as power. So the key concepts here is that the meaning of existence is living in accord with nature. And nature, it also features in previous philosophies we see in Greece. But nature here means actually flowing with nature, not fighting against nature, not seeing nature as something separate and distinct, but actually something that we are all part of, and that nature itself, or the ultimate reality, is an integrated network. Another key concept within that is simplicity and spontaneity, Ziran. This is about not trying to create complex theories, complicated machinery, and planning to an extent where you're paralyzed by your analysis. So Taoism puts a lot of emphasis on leading a simple life, but also being spontaneous, and this includes being open to new things. Because the key concern in Taoism is that we are so wrapped in our everyday life that actually we miss most of the opportunities that life presents to us by being too closed-minded. Another concept is the concept of Wu Wei, which literally translated is acting without acting. And that's a very interesting concept, which is actually effortless action is another translation, where we don't necessarily, in order to drive the right results for ourselves and those around us, we don't need to be involved or in control of everything that unfolds. It is more by actually being in a particular state of being, and there's a certain attitude and a certain approach to the way we bring to things that are far more important. So even by not doing anything ourselves, just by demonstrating what we're like, we can actually achieve a lot, and a lot gets done. So this is how it starts. The one, which is Qi, the eternal energy, gives rise to the two, which is yin and yang, the opposing forces of the male and the female, light and dark, etc. And this is a well-known symbol in the West. I'm not sure how many really understand its real meaning. If you can see the both black and white elements, each have got within them the color of the opposing force, which basically suggests that they are both contain each other within each other, and this is how the universe unfolds. Everything originates from the eternal, from the chi, from the one, and returns to it. And that is a very important concept, is that this is an ongoing process throughout history where things return back to the source and are recreated for the future. And I suppose Taoism really combines the idea of being and becoming. It's not just a simple state of being, it is also an ongoing process of how we change the world, how the world changes us. It's quite an interactive process between the individual, the group, the world, and the universe as a whole. And the nature of being is, as I've mentioned earlier, is all about living in accordance with nature. Now, nature may change, and we may need to adapt to that nature, but it is actually living in accordance with and with nature as one, rather than separating ourselves from nature. And then finally, eternity is a circle without beginning or an end. So the chi, the universal energy, has always existed and will always exist, and from it will spring the universal forces of yin and yang, and all the 10,000 entities, I think it says in the Tao Te Ching, which is basically everything else in existence. And it is an ongoing and continuous circle. The next Chinese philosophy we encounter, and I think most people are familiar with, to some extent, at least some of the basic sayings, is Confucianism. And Confucianism is a philosophy which is running concurrently with Taoism, but it's a very different emphasis. And Confucians and Taoists are not friendly towards each other in general, because their view is very different. Whereas the Taoists focus on nature, Confucius and Confucians really focus on determined roles and states and organization in life. Well, the founder of Confucianism was Confucius, which is a Latin translation. It was actually Master Kong, or Kung Tzu, who lived in the 6th century BCE. He was a learned man living at the court. And for him, the meaning of existence is harmony. Now, that is not surprising, because during the Warring States period, chaos ensued throughout China, and clearly Confucius himself encountered this and felt that actually this is barbaric. This is probably the worst kind of existence to have, where everybody was fearing for their lives, nobody had certainty, there were shortages in food supply, people were taken off to war, etc. So as far as he was concerned, he wanted to rectify that, and his key tenet here is harmony. Now, harmony arises from the relationship and are exhibited through virtues, Wu Chang. And Confucius names a number of important virtues that it is very important to culture. Now, these virtues, he believed that these are something that can be acquired, can be learned. We are not born with these virtues need to be taught. And these are the key 5 virtues. It starts off with Ren, which is benevolence or loving kindness. It's we need to have a certain attitude or culture, a certain attitude and behavior in this world in order to become a junzi, which is a gentleman. Yi, righteousness, is another key virtue, in terms of actually the way we follow things through. It needs to be done in the right manner, with the right kind of rituals, kind of rites, etc. And Li is right manner in terms of how we behave. Zi is acquiring the right knowledge, and Qin is integrity. Actually, and again, you see echoes from Aristotle and his moral compass in order to actually become a virtuous human being. And accompanied by these is Zong or Zhong, which is loyalty, and Shu, reciprocity, and Lian, honesty. So as you can see, in order to become a junzi, which I mentioned earlier was a gentleman, an individual really had to cultivate all of these virtues, and the only way this would be possible is through education, but also in terms of finding your own station in life. And this is the other very important element of Confucian philosophy. It is about doing all of these virtues in certain relationships. And these relationships exist between ruler and citizen, between husband and wife, father and son, the older son to the younger son, the oldest daughter to the younger daughter. They all have a station in life, a role to play. And I think this is very, very different to Taoism, where effectively live according to nature and you will be okay. Your life will be fulfilling. Here it is much more structured. It's much more socialized. It's much more rigid in terms of the kind of role you play. To some extent, it's similar to the caste system in Hinduism. You have your station of life, and it's within that station of life that you perfect yourself through virtue. So as a citizen, your virtue, in terms of perfecting your virtues, it will be very different to the emperor, for example, who will practice virtues in a very different way. So, but it is exercising your virtues according to the station of your life. Finally, and I think this is probably even less known in the West, is the philosophy of MOISM. Again, more or less a compatriot of both Taoism and Confucianism. And the creator, founder, is Mozi, who lived in the 5th century BCE. And it is at the surface a very, very simple philosophy in terms of the meaning of existence. And that is Ren. And we encountered with Confucius on the previous slide, but Ren is slightly different here. The key meaning of existence in Moism is the inclusive and impartial love for everyone in the world. It is sometimes translated as universal impartial care, but what is meant, it's inclusive, it's impartial, and it demonstrates a real care, love for yourself, for the others in the world, and the world itself. And it is that kind of basic concept from which you can then depart and lead your life in a way that's commensurate with a flourishing life. Yes, as I mentioned, this is all about behavior. This isn't about tradition. This isn't about funerary rites. This isn't about sermons and worship. This isn't about social conventions. All it is about is your own personal behavior in terms of how you interact with those around you in the world. And conflict arises purely because of differences in culture rather than in nature. It's interesting, the question of human nature we haven't brought out explicitly so far throughout this lecture series, but clearly from what has been discussed before, it's very easy to see what different people thought of humanity. So for example, Confucius had a very different legacy from the Warring State period, as did Mozi. As far as Confucius is concerned, chaos is ruling. We need to bring it under control. We need to have a early social contract in place where everybody knows what their station in life is and they need to behave accordingly. Whereas in MOISM, Mozi thinks that human nature is effectively basically good. And the only reason why conflict arises is because there are different cultural practices, rather than that humanity has a nature that is already devoid of goodness. And society is seen as an organism that changes, grows, fades away, gets reborn, etc. And it needs to be organized, and the only organizing factor is the inclusive and impartial love for everyone in the world. Now, interestingly enough, we talked about social contract. As far as MOISM is concerned, they believe that actually a meritocracy represents the best form of government. So it's a bit like even in ancient Greece, democracy was seen as one of a terrible idea. Winston Churchill said it's a terrible idea, but it's better than all the ones that have been tried before. As far as MOISM is concerned, well, maybe we should try meritocracy, where those people who are exhibiting Ren, inclusive and impartial love for everyone in the world, should be the ones that are actually the leaders who are exhibiting and demonstrating that inclusivity and impartial love, which then gets transmitted to the rest of the population. As I mentioned, it's really about simplicity, it's about integrity, being true to yourself, and impartial love as being the meaning of existence. Those are the sort of three key elements which we've also already seen with Aristotle through eudaimonia, virtue and moral conviction. That's it for this particular edition, part 3 of this mini philosophy series on the meaning of existence and being and becoming. Next week or so, we are going to be turning back into the West, and we'll be focusing on philosophy from the Enlightenment to modern philosophy, which returns to the West. And you will find that there's lots of wisdom both from the early West and the later East that will be incorporated in that philosophy. So thank you very much for participating in the third of the lecture series, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye bye.